Hello, ladies and gentlemen, or just ladies, or just gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. I don't really have any kind of revolutionary point to make in this video. I've got a simple point to make, and it revolves around the economics of incentives, right? So we can use incentives, we can use policy incentives to incentivize people to do certain things and to do certain things, and we can de-incentivize them. We can incentivize them to do certain things, and then we can de-incentivize in the other direction. And you know, so how do you increase voter turnout, right? One obvious mode of trying to do that is to attach beneficial incentives to voting, attach literal incentives, literal benefits, concrete benefits to voting, right? How do you get people to turn out for elections to vote? You incentivize them to vote, right? Because the logic of a civic duty is not very persuasive. So you need something more intrinsically motivating to get them to vote. That's how you make things work. That's how you get people to do good things, to do socially advantageous, beneficial things. You can de-incentivize them with things like deterrence, criminal punishment, etc. You can incentivize them with other things. So you can incentivize them, right, with positives, positive benefits and whatnot, and you de-incentivize them with negatives. Is one way of putting it, although I really didn't need to describe that any further. In any case, there does seem to be some issue with turnout, right? Voter turnout. And when voter turnout is poor, we have low voter turnout. You cannot have a democratic government, a truly democratic, a truly representative government if people simply don't vote, because what ends up happening is when so few people vote, when you have such a low voter turnout, what ends up happening is the small number of people that do end up voting decide the outcome of the election, and thus it's not the majority, it's not the people as a whole, it's just that small sliver of the population that it is then deciding for the rest what the outcome of the election is going to be. Is that democratic? When one small sliver of the population that does vote decides the outcome of the election for the rest of the population that doesn't vote? So it just doesn't seem, that's not democracy. So how do we get people to do things is the question. You incentivize them. You create direct, tangible, immediate, concrete incentives, literal benefits to doing certain things. And voting is one of those. I mean, we shouldn't be framing this in terms of duty. We should be framing this in terms of, sure, we can frame it in terms of duty, theoretically, ethically, but it's not going to cut it if it's just an ethical abstract, individuals are simply not going to act on an ethical abstraction, right? I mean, they do, some do. Obviously, some vote. But it's just not good enough for the majority of the population, and that's fine, right? So, and don't, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, a lot of people do vote. I mean, it's not as if no one is turning out. It's just that we don't have. This is why we have to rely on plurality voting, right? Because if we did on plurality systems of voting, which is winner take all, um, that's contraposed to a majority system of voting, right? By which the majority wins. So with a plurality system, you just take the winner of the votes that were cast. In a majority system, you need to have a majority. You need to have a majority of a literal majority of the voting population vote, right? To determine who the winner becomes. So, with regard to plurality systems, there is no minimum, right, for how many people need to turn out. For majority systems, there is a minimum, and that minimum is right. So there is a minimum, and that minimum is more than the majority. So there's some minimum that is above than the majority. Of course, it's actually it's actually not. So with a majority system, I believe that would require then for everyone to turn out, because you need no. It only would require the majority of the voting population, right? So it would be some amount above the majority of the population, of the voting population. With plurality systems, uh, with plurality systems, there is no specific minimum amount of voter turnout required. Yeah. So you just take in plurality systems, which we have in most congressional districts, I believe in presidential elections, it's winner take all. You just take the winner of the votes that were cast, of the voting population. So in a plurality system of voting, which the congressional districts run on, and the presidential districts run on, what decides the outcome is just the winner of the population that voted, of the votes, from the votes of the population that voted. For a majority system to decide the outcome of the election and the winner of the election, you would specifically need to tabulate whoever the winner is, taking into account the total, total voting population, the majority of whatever the majority is for the total voting population. So, with regard to plurality voting, I don't want to go too far off onto this. It's just winner take all, and it's the same with a majority voting system. But in the majority voting system, you need a certain level of turnout. You need the majority, the majority of the voting population. So in the case of the majority voting system, what decides the outcome? So what determines who then becomes the next representative or president? It's in a majority voting system. We decide that based on what the majority of the total voting population says. In a plurality system, we decide who becomes the next president or congressman based on what the majority is, right? who wins the majority within the votes cast by the population that voted. Not the total population. So, in any case, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but there's something that needs to be. So, okay. So how it seems that low voter turnout, right? These plurality systems, these winner take all plurality systems of voting, they don't generate. Um, they do a poor job of ensuring that the government is actually representative in a democratic sense, because they create a situation where a small number of voters determine the outcome of an election that is then imposed upon all the voters that did not vote. So, yeah, it just doesn't end up being the governments produced like a government that, or an election outcome and a government that is produced by these plurality voting systems, these winner take all plurality voting systems, um, are create situations where specifically a small number of the population, the small sliver, the small portion of the population that votes or voted decides the outcome for those that did not vote. If only a small portion of the population dictates to the other portion what the outcome will be, that's not democratic. It's not very representative. So, how do we resolve that? Well, you increased one, so it would seem to me that to have a majority, a majority, right, voting system where a majority of the total population is required to decide the outcome of any given election, that would require very high turnout. It would ultimately force us probably to compel people to vote, or to increase incentives so that we can get that basic minimum that the majority voting system would require. Um, on the other hand, we could keep the plurality systems that we currently have, winner take all plurality systems we currently have, where of the population that voted, the winner, as calculated by the votes that were cast by the voting population. In that plurality winner take all system, we could keep that. But ultimately, if we want to, so it seems that, we would have to, in order to just, right, so to decide, if we say that, to decide an outcome of the election, we need a majority, right, a majority of the district for this person to become the winner, a majority of the district, of the voting population, not just the voting population, but the total population. A majority of the population must elect this person for them to become the next representative. And so, but then we would just have to, we'd have to really incentivize voter turnout in various ways, or we would have to just outright, compel voting so that we could achieve that, that achieve the requisite, we could achieve the requisite votes, to decide by a majority who becomes, the next elected representative, be it a congressman or president or whatever. So that would seem, those types of systems where the majority of the total population is required. So that's the difference, right? So these types of systems where it's the majority of the total population that would be required to elect the next president or congressman, those systems that require a majority of the total population rather than just the voting population, certainly are impractical. So I don't know if we could really institute anything like that, but it would lead to a more democratic representative result because more people would inherently be voting. It wouldn't be totally representative or democratic because we'd still have majority rule. The one that wins imposes on the loser, right? So the winner imposes upon the loser. And the winner is represented and the loser is not. But at least it would ensure that it's a little bit more that it might ensure that the person that's ultimately elected is more or less representative of his or her given district. If we have, of course, there's no science to that. There's no exact science to that. But that would be at least a good starting point. But the problem is that, so that's the difference, right? So if we have a system of voting, we decide the winner of the election, the next president or congressman or elected representative. We require a majority system says we have to have a majority of the total population in that district or country before we can decide the winner. In a plurality system, it's different. You just need a majority of the voting population, not of the total population. So plurality, because these majority systems would probably require us to compel voting or really incentivize voting to get the requisite number of votes to get the majority, then probably less good system. It's less practical. So if it's more practical for us to, then it would be more practical for us probably, because we can't compel voting. We can't compel people to vote in elections, right? There are various problems with that. I could present arguments in another video, but one is voting is a kind of speech. If you force someone to vote, you're compelling speech. That's not free speech. Compelled speech is not free speech. Hence, it would violate. So on one point, compelled speech, right? So forced voting, right? We can't, in this country, there are constitutional precedents. We cannot have compelled voting, forced voting by law, because it does, I think, violate free speech, the Free Speech Amendment, because it's compelled speech. So, okay, so can't do that. So that now we just have then that being the case, we have to stick with the plurality system, right? That we currently have, not a majority of the total population to decide the winner, but a majority of just the voting population to decide the winner, right? I mean, it's bad because democracy and being representative is about representing everyone, right? Well, even in a majority voting system, only the majority is then represented. That's not democracy, because only the majority wins. In a plurality system, it's even less democratic, right? Because then it's just a majority, right, of the voting population. So most people don't vote; they're not represented. Then of those that do vote, only the majority wins, hence still of the population that does vote, still not represented. So majority systems are certainly more. So we don't really, the key here is that democracy is an ideal that we really don't have if we're going to have a majority rule type of winner take all system. So anyway, everything else moving toward a majority system requiring a majority of the total population to decide the winner, ruling that out as impractical because of free speech and because of limited incentivization abilities with policy. We'll then just go with the plurality system, probably for the best. Regrettably, but it's probably for. So, okay, we'll stick with our plurality system. We only need a majority of the voting population to decide the winner, not the majority of the total population. Okay, where do we go from there, right? How do we get people using just this basic winner-take-all plurality system, just getting a majority of the voting population to decide the winner rather than a majority of the total population? How do we get people to vote under that plurality rather than majority system? I think that hopefully my terms are correct here, right? Because hopefully my terms are correct here, but please, if I'm misusing any terms, any political science terms, if I'm misusing any political science terms, please correct me, right? Because it's been a couple of years since I've taken a poli-sci class. So feel free to berate me in the comment section with terminological tinkering or whatever. Whatever. I mean, it's a, the comment section is yours, not mine. So how do we incentivize more turnout? Because more turnout means the outcomes of elections, ideally, the overall composition of government, is more representative and democratic. So how do we do that? How do we increase turnout? I believe that we just need to incentivize turnout. We need to incentivize voting. We just need to encourage it with economic incentives, direct, immediate, tangible, concrete incentives attached to voting. I don't think that we need to frame voting in terms of a duty. It is a duty, I think. Ethically, we can regard it as a duty, but ethical abstractions don't motivate anyone. It's immediate, tangible, concrete benefits that do. So, realistically, conceding to the dismal science of economics, that's just a fact. Okay, moving on. What incentives would I attach to voting? What would I suggest? Tax credits, right? Just use tax credits. What I would call tax return add-ons. If you vote in that election, next year when you get your tax return, there will be an added $75 or an added $50. And maybe there could be, but this idea of a tax return add-on seems to me to be pretty compelling. I mean, maybe not compelling, but at least interesting. People then would see, oh, I get paid, not really paid, right? Some of your money is given back to you. Some of the revenue that the gross revenue that the government collects will be given back to you in the form of a tax return add-on. And so next year when you get this, you get an extra $75. I don't know how much it would really cost the government. We may have to redistribute the budget so that this could work. But ultimately, I think that some sort of fiscal incentive, some sort of economic tax incentive in that way could spur on voting. Would it really get people to vote? I don't really know, because I don't know how long-term people think usually. And people don't really care about an extra $75 if it's a year from now. They may care about an extra $75 now, but I don't know if they'd really care about it a year from now. Some would, and so that would get those out to vote. For others, not so much. Not that there's a better way of thinking about things. We have to think both short term and long term. But in any case, maybe this idea of a tax return add-on, that's an immediate benefit of voting, and sort of a pay it back, kind of benefit for you doing your civic duty, which it really isn't a duty if we're paying you to do it. But regardless, I think something like that could very easily work. And this would at least get people out, and would get people. Okay, so sure, it incentivizes people to vote, to come out and vote. Maybe in the future it's even easier. We can make voting even easier, right? I mean, just do it on your tablet or on your smartphone. Have multiple walls of security and encryption and authentication backing it up, but ultimately increasing turnout is about decreasing the difficulty of voting, making it universally convenient and immediately accessible. I'm fine with IDs, but that's not really the point. The point is that it's accessible immediately and conveniently. That will help increase turnout, and then we can even add on these tax incentives for diligent voters that do their duty, right, to their country. And so what better reward for that duty than an immediate concrete incentive or benefit like the tax return add-on? In addition to whatever you get for your tax return, we'll add on this additional sum. And that's because we regard you doing your duty as a voter as a good thing. And we're thanking you for doing that. I think that some combination, acknowledging that this majority system of voting, where the majority of the total population must decide the winner, is impractical both on free speech grounds and for various other reasons. I think this new system of well, it's not a new system. The alternative system, which I would regard as more practical. I guess I'm talking on the topic of another video, but this alternative system, which I would regard as far more practical, which is the plurality winner take all system. You don't need a majority of the total population. You just need a majority of the voting population to decide who wins an election. Is much more practical. But, it doesn't ensure that we have high turnout. And any voluntary voting system won't. So instead of compelling voting, incentivize voting, with a gentler touch. And in doing so, we can definitely make some progress in improving the turnout problem, or not totally correcting it, but some. And I admit this new technology will make voting easier. That's good. So we just need to advance that technology, and really we have the technology. It's about implementing it and trusting it to do what it would do well. And but the turnout problem is a real problem, because if we can't solve this turnout problem, we perpetuate a undemocratic and fundamentally undemocratic and unrepresentative government, which may be more or less undemocratic and unrepresentative anyway, because of the fact that majority rule systems of voting, by which the majority decides who wins, ultimately are just the essence of the tyranny of the majority problem, where the majority is represented and the minority is not. So we just have to, in that sense, any democratic system that relies upon representative democracy, that relies in its elections upon voting majority rule systems of voting, and winner take all majority rule systems of voting, kind of just result in tyranny of the majority. Majority wins, majority represented, minority loses, minority not represented. So the whole ideal of democracy is a farce, but we're assuming we're really just operating within the whole ideal of democracy is a farce. It's an ideal, right? It's more or less workable. We can make things. It's not a switch. It's not a switch. It's a spectrum, right? So we can make it more ideally. Democracy is a very good thing. I'm not saying it's not. Democracy is a good ideal, even if it is an ideal, and it's something that we should be working toward. More checks upon power, more democratic governance, more diversity, more power checking power. Two heads better than one, three heads better than two, four heads better than three. All of that. all good things. Democracy is a check on power ultimately, and it's a good one at that. But democracy, as much as it's a good thing, isn't ideal because it is a perfect state of things that simply can't exist. Logistically, democracy can't really be executed logistically, but we can move closer and closer toward the ideal, even if we'll never actually reach the ideal. So even if the thing is an ideal, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't move toward it. It means that we acknowledge that it's a perfect state of things that is unachievable, but that continually attempting to redesign our systems to move closer and closer toward it, that's good, that's what ultimately brings progress. So it's not a question of the government is not either democratic or undemocratic. It is more democratic or less democratic. And that's a very important thing to realize, is that you have switches on and off, one or the other, and you have spectrums, right? Where it's both this and that, depending on how you slide along that spectrum or whatever. So nonetheless, democracy is an ideal that we should continually strive to move toward because it's a check upon corruption and power. Um, but it's also mostly logistically and practically unachievable, just based on how we have to logistically design and execute our elections, right? Yeah. So you're going to have any time, right? So you don't have one representative per one person. You have one representative per at least two, one representing a group. Whenever you have one person representing a certain group as a unit, right, then you're going to have a system, an electoral system by which you decide between that group, the members of that group, who becomes their representative. How do you do that? To decide one to represent the many. What do you well, you can have you have an election. Okay. Well, then what decides who wins if the group splits? They disagree. They have different feelings about who the representative should be. Well, then what decides who becomes the representative if they disagree? An election. And so the election, and so then, assuming an election, how then is the election decided, right? Um, what specific increments of, what specific margins of victory are needed to decide a winner? And ultimately, that's what it's all about. And because there will be disagreement, who decides, right? So at what point in an election between them to decide the representative of them, at what point do we decide what numbers, are needed to decide who the representative is and is going to be? And the most logical solution is to decide by majority. And really you have to decide by majority. um, I think it's mathematically obvious that you must decide by some sort of majority of the voters decide. And I think that's because of how, uh, yeah, yeah. So how do we decide elections then? It's by some sort of, by then taking voting amongst each other and then counting the votes for each given candidate, and then, well, simply deciding that, whatever candidate um, gets the most votes wins. And that's all inevitable. There's no other way that we can really do that. So mathematically, and just on the logic of how that group decision is made, right? And that amalgam of votes is then considered. There's no other logical way, to me, where you'd be able to then decide the winner without simply tabulating, who got the most votes. uh, yeah. So in any case, all this is to say that to make the government, and the Congress and the presidency more and more democratic and representative, then we need to increase voter turnout. And so, how do we increase voter turnout? Well, we cannot compel voters to turn out by law. That would violate freedom of speech. So if we can't compel, we need to just incentivize. And by incentivizing through what I've proposed here, which are through tax credits and tax return add-ons, a sum of money the government will give back to you at the end of the next year with your tax return, or the beginning of the next year with your tax return, as a benefit for voting, would immediately provide an economic fiscal incentive for people to go out and vote to get that extra tax return add-on, to get that extra money. And that would get them out there. We would increase voter turnout that way. And that increased turnout, right, would then lead to ideally more representative government, more democratic government. But in any case, I also talked about briefly in this video, and that was the main point. But I also talked about briefly in this video about plurality versus majority voting systems for elections. How do we decide who becomes the next elected representative? How do we decide the winner? We either do it by plurality, finding the majority of the voting population, or we do it by majority, by calculating the votes by establishing who won the majority of the total population. In a plurality system, to decide the winner, you only need the majority of the voting population. In a majority system, to decide the winner, you need the majority of not just the voting population, but the total population. So that's an important distinction there. Anyway, hopefully you appreciate my integration of political science and economics. Hopefully you appreciate at least my attempt to integrate political science and economics by trying to increase voter turnout through the use of immediate fiscal and economic incentives, like tax credits, or tax return add-ons. And in this way, we can hopefully, if we can't compel voter turnout, at least incentivize greater voter turnout. Thank you for watching.